Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to be having the final webinar in our series of 6 webinars this winter-spring 2016. And I again want to welcome you to our Consumers in the Global Supply Chain event today. My name is Christina Bain, and I'm the Director of the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery at Babson College, where we're broadcasting live here in Wellesley, Massachusetts, USA. And we're thrilled that you could all be with us today for our 2-hour discussion on a really, really critical part of how we're going to be able to address human trafficking now and in the future, and how we've been doing it in the past as well. So I want to thank my co-hosts on this, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. You're going to be hearing more from them a little bit later. And I also want to thank right at the start our technical folks who are with us today, Lena Wu, John Florendo, and Ian McLeod, who are working with us today to make sure we have a smooth sail with the webinar from a technical standpoint. So thank you for your work on this. So I want to mention our sponsor today, Denton's Global LLC. Denton's is a global law firm. They're the largest global law firm worldwide. And we're thrilled again to have them sponsoring our webinar today. They're doing some tremendous work on human trafficking. If you have not looked at their website before or heard of them, it's www.dentons.com. They have, again, many offices across the globe. Here in the United States, they're particularly working with victims of human trafficking and survivors, and they're doing pro bono work in the South, in the U.S., and they also hold a number of seminars and events and initiatives, particularly around this issue of supply chains, labor, and human trafficking. So I do encourage you to check them out. I also want to thank the Terrorism, Transnational Crime, and Corruption Center at George Mason University, and I want to particularly thank Louise Shelley and Casey Crenard, who have been working with us on promoting these webinars and for the great work that they do in the field addressing transnational organized crime and issues like terrorism and human trafficking each and every day. So thank you for your support on this. So again, I just want to mention that today is our final webinar in the series that we've had of 6 webinars focused on supply chains, human trafficking, and the private sector. This is the 2nd series that we've done looking at issues surrounding what the private sector can do to fight human trafficking. So this is a really exciting topic, and we hope that today that you'll learn so much about what everyone can do as a consumer and how we can create our own social movements around this issue with the goods that we buy in our everyday interactions. So now I want to tell you a bit about what we do here at Babson and the Initiative on Human Trafficking and Modern Slavery. So we began this program back in 2013, bringing together entrepreneurial minds, students and business leaders, corporate, NGO, and governmental partners, human trafficking and modern slavery activists from across the globe in order to learn, network, and build innovative approaches to advancing human freedom. In addition, we're leveraging expertise and researchers from the college to develop cutting-edge research, classroom approaches, and action-oriented initiatives to educate and really activate the next generation of anti-trafficking business leaders. And we're doing a number of things on campus, including organizing students, not only here but in the New England area. We're also working in the classroom at the high school secondary level and training students to become business leaders and to start their own businesses to solve human trafficking, and that's through the Human Freedom Entrepreneurial Leadership Program. And we're going to be having more information about that on our website coming shortly. This is the website. It's www.babson.edu/IHTMS, and I encourage you to check it out. We're going to be putting up all the latest in events and also the recordings of all of these webinars that we've had. We're recording each of them. So for those of you who missed a portion of it, may have to step out because I know it's 2 hours, which is a long time to commit, but also for those who were not able to be with us today, we are recording these. So those will be up on not only the Babson website, but on the Global Initiative website as well. So I want to stop talking here because we have a full panel and presentations to go through, and then we want to get your questions at the end of within the final hour. So to let you know how this is going to work from the technical side, we're all going to be using the chat box that you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen to communicate with each other. I encourage all of you to send in your questions immediately as you think of them as we're having the presentations. That way we'll have a number of questions in the queue lineup to go over when we do have the discussion, and we're going to try to get to all of your questions. So do type in the text chat box. If you have any concerns about how to do that, please send us an email. You can send me an email at cbain@babson.edu, cbain@babson.edu, if you have any problems using the text chat box, but that's what we're going to be communicating today. So now I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Livia Wagner, who is the private sector advisor for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and our co-host today, and she's going to be telling us about the work that they're doing with the Global Initiative. Livia?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Christina and the Babson College, for the great partnership the last 2 years. And it has been an incredible year for this webinar series with very enthusiastic speakers and great topics. And we are very happy to conclude this webinar series with our excellent speakers on consumer engagement. I'm going to quickly talk about the Global Initiative. As mentioned, I'm the private sector advisor at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. The GI is a network, and we were formally launched in September 2013. And now we have more than 100 independent global and regional experts working on law enforcement, human rights, democracy, governance, and development issues. And we are registered as a non-profit civil society organization in Geneva, Switzerland. And as you can see, our objectives from the Global Initiative are threefold. That means the first one is strategic. We want to promote more effective joined-up responses. And also analytical. That means we want to raise awareness and open the debate about the nature and the extent of organized crime. But we also want to be responsive and serve as a source partner with regional, national, and international players. Our substantive priorities, as you can see here, all the different forms of organized crime are the different forms that you can see here, like the arms trafficking, cybercrime, drug trafficking, environmental crime, money laundering, piracy, and human trafficking. And I personally look after the issue of human trafficking. So the genesis of the GI is that it was conceived after a series of closed forum discussions with senior law enforcement officials and experts also from other multilateral organizations. As the participants, they thought that a network of experts is necessary, which serves or could serve as a necessary tool to develop not only more strategic and global approaches to counter organized crime, but also because transnational organized crime is not always very well analyzed and understood, and very often also not systematically integrated in national action plans, national policies, and so on. So what we do in terms of human trafficking is that we find that there is an urgency of developing collaborative approaches to address human trafficking. And we have focused very much on human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. You can find all our publications and research documents on our website, which is the www.globalinitiative.net. And there we have also put human trafficking in the framework with other organized crime-related forms, like, for instance, the last publication was on illegal gold mining in relation with human trafficking, for instance, or other forms of organized crime. And for us, it's very important to engage with the private sector, as we acknowledge that the private sector has a very important role to also counter human trafficking. And we're also talking today about the consumer role to tackle human trafficking. I'm very excited to be part of this. Thank you very much. Hi, Christina, can you hear me?
Okay. Hi, Livia. Thank you. We're just changing the slides. Thank you so much for your presentation, and thank you for the outstanding work that you do. So now we're going to be getting into our speaker panels I'm going to introduce our moderator, and I'm thrilled to be announcing Faris Natour will be moderating our session today. And Faris is a great and fantastic colleague that I work with on the World Economic Forum. We serve together on the Human Rights Council, and I knew of no one better to moderate this panel than with Faris. So to give you some background on him, you can see his bio slide up here. We're going to be putting up all the bios of each of the panelists that you can see. He's the co-founder and principal of Article 1 Advisors, which he's going to tell you a bit more about. He's also the director of the Human Rights and Business Initiative at the Haas School of Business at the University of California at Berkeley. And he's an internationally recognized expert with over 15 years of experience working at the intersection of business and human rights. He is, as a principal of Article 1, and you can see his website right there, he advises corporate and institutional on human rights strategy and management with the aim of embedding human rights throughout business and institutional operations. He leads the Human Rights and Business Initiative at the Center for Responsible Business at the Haas School of Business, where he's teaching and educating on business and human rights, and he also drives research and collaboration among many business leaders and stakeholders who are working on these critical human rights issues. And you also can see the website there for his institution, and I really encourage you to check out the wonderful work that they're doing on human rights globally. And I will now turn this over to Faris. Faris, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Christina. It's a real honor to be moderating today and to be part of a, I would say, very distinguished panel of experts on particularly this topic today of consumer engagement when it comes to human trafficking and human rights in global supply chains. I will, as Christina mentioned, give a quick update. I'm going to wait here for the right slides, I guess, to be uploaded on the WebEx. But I can tell you, while we do that, a little bit more about Article 1. Those of you who've joined the last webinar know us already from my colleague Chloe Poynton, who served as moderator last month. We are a human rights and business consultancy working with companies and governments, international organizations to develop and implement human rights strategies and management systems. And we help businesses succeed through effective integration of human rights throughout their business and their companies. And as Christina mentioned, I also run the Human Rights and Business Initiative at UC Berkeley at the Haas School of Business, and I think both of my kind of hats that I'm wearing are really geared towards this ultimate vision of embedding human rights in business. Right, you do that in the short term as a consultant with companies, and then in the long term by embedding human rights in management education and ensuring that the next generation of business leaders enters the business world with full understanding and awareness and expertise in how businesses may impact human rights, how their decisions may impact human rights, and and making sure that they integrate human rights effectively in their companies, regardless of where they sit in those companies. So we do that at Berkeley through three pillars. Teaching, we offer a course on business and human rights in both the MBA program and the undergraduate program. We do that through research, where we're advancing research on the financial materiality of human rights in business, other research topics. We do case studies of companies addressing critical human rights challenges, such as the one we're talking about today. And we want to offer Berkeley's kind of neutral space for collaboration and dialogue between stakeholders to bring them together to solve complex challenges. What we're talking about today, though, is consumers in the global supply chain and the role of consumers, the way that we can engage consumers in the fight against human trafficking and modern slavery. And I want to set us off here with a quick story from my teaching at Berkeley. So I teach a course on business and human rights, and pretty early on in the course, I always ask the students the why question, right? Why do companies care about human rights? What motivates a large multinational company to develop a human rights policy, to conduct a human rights impact assessment, and to address issues like human trafficking in the supply chain? And the students have a lot of great points, and they're all right. They will tell you this is good for business. Employees care about this. So for recruiting the best talent out there, it's important to demonstrate a strong value system. You could get sued if you have a human rights challenge. So reducing legal risk is a critical driver. Improving your reputation and strengthening your brand. Of course, it's also the right thing to do. And then before long, one of the students will say, well, and consumers really care about this issue, and they want to purchase goods and products and services that are produced with respect for human rights. And then I usually respond and say, well, that's very interesting, and you all are not just students in this class, but you're also consumers, right? And nowadays, it wasn't like this when I went to college, but now you see just a kind of sea of laptops in front of you in the classroom. And so I asked the students, well, you all have bought these laptops, right? And when you did so, that's a pretty significant purchase, right, for a student. Did you consider the human rights performance of the maker of the laptop or the conditions under which that laptop was made when you made that purchasing decision? And usually the students say like, not really. I kind of went with the one that I wanted. And that really strikes me every time, because these are the students that self-selected for a human rights and business course. They go to Berkeley, which has a strong, human rights advocacy tradition, and even that group, college students interested in human rights and business, don't necessarily consider the human rights implications of, how the product is made when making a fairly significant purchasing decision. I usually make the students feel better in saying that, even I, who's been working for over 15 years now at the intersection of human rights and business, I have to admit that I also don't always fully consider those impacts at every single purchase that I make, right? And so this really kind of raises the key challenge that we have here, right? Why is it so difficult? What can we do to really get consumers more engaged and enable them to make more informed decisions when it comes to human rights? So for today's discussion, I think the three questions that I think are critical for us to try to explore are exactly those. First, why is this so difficult? Second, how do we effectively engage consumers? And I think we have three of the world's best experts on how to do that on the webinar today. And third, then, who are the consumers that we really need to reach, right? Where are they? And what's an effective strategy to engage them, given who they are? So we have a fantastic panel today with Martin and Francesco and Aisha. And we'll go first to Martin Atkin, who is based in my home country of Germany, and is with Fair Trade International. And I should have the bio slide up here. I guess we need to make a quick slide change as well. But I can introduce Martin while we're waiting for that. So Martin is currently the head of communications for Fair Trade International. He has been a communications consultant, has founded the company Funnelweb Media, which is a communications agency that specializes in sustainability, environmental and development and human rights issues. So he knows a little bit about how to reach all of us and how to engage us on these topics. He's a journalist by background. He was creative director of Greenpeace International, the media director at WWF International, and has acted as a consultant to MSF, to ActionAid, Amnesty International, and many other clients. So with that, Martin, I will turn it over to you for your initial remarks. And before I do so, I will remind everyone again to think about really tough questions to ask Martin and our other panelists today. And as they come up, when you have a question, you can use the chat box on the WebEx, the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll collect those, and they will greatly aid an interactive discussion that we'll have after our panelists have presented their initial remarks. So with that, Martin, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Faris. I'm just getting my presentation up here, but I should say, first of all, that something appears to have happened to the formatting of the presentation between leaving me and getting to you guys. So I must apologize for that, because it doesn't quite look as it should do. But nonetheless, I hope you'll be able to follow me as we go through it. First of all, I want to give you a bit of context about why fair trade works in this area and what fair trade has to do with child and forced labor in the supply chain. Many of you will be familiar with the Maplecroft Child Labor Index, and looking at the map there, you can see that it's no coincidence that many of the countries that have an extreme risk rating are also the countries that fair trade tends to operate in. We also, when we look at the commodities that fair trade is involved in and the countries that we operate in, you can see here that, again, it is no coincidence or surprise that fair trade is involved in these issues. And this is why fair trade over the last few years has really ramped up its work on child labor and forced labor issues. I just want to show you a few slides of recent media coverage and of these kind of issues. So this is from a program which was broadcast on the BBC last year about human rights abuses in the tea industry in Assam. Here we have an example from Reuters about why it's important to clean up the textile supply chain, and I'll be talking a little bit about fair trade's work in the textile supply chain later on. Is fair trade coffee the answer? This is a blog from the Human Trafficking Center. And supply chain, again, from The Guardian. So you can see that, just to give you a sense of the context that we're operating in, fair trade is very much involved in trying to address these issues of child labor and of forced labor and human trafficking in various different supply chains. So sometimes, people sometimes ask, what has fair trade got to do with these issues? Well, it's very much to do with trying to improve human rights throughout the supply chain. Just to talk a little bit about our audiences and why we are communicating about these things. So we talk mainly to 4 audience segments, if you like: producers, businesses, donors and funders, and consumers. And the one thing that all these audiences have in common is that they're all demanding evidence of impact. And what that means is that whether you're buying fair trade coffee in your local supermarket, or whether you're a major funder giving, potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds to fair trade to work on these programs, whether you're a business that's considering stocking or trading in fair trade products, or whether you're a producer at the sharp end of producing these commodities, all of these audiences, all of these groups of people want to know, fair trade, so what? What are you actually doing to address the problems of human trafficking, of child labor, of forced labor in the supply chain? So that's why we're investing a lot of time and effort and money into this area. Just to talk a little bit about the fair trade standards. So the standards are the set of regulations, if you like, that fair trade applies to ensure that fair trade products are traded produced and traded to fair trade to our standards. And the first thing to say is that no person or organisation can provide a 100% guarantee that a product is free of child or forced labour, and fair trade never says that we can provide that guarantee. What we do say, though, is that we provide an assurance that we will act to protect impacted individuals. So we always, whenever a case of either child or forced labour is brought to our attention, or we come across it ourselves, we always assess and report human rights allegations to national protection agencies for follow-up, and we always investigate and report any allegations or breaches. Now, there are 3 standards which apply to which are relevant to what we're talking about today. The first one is what we call our small producer organisation standard, and the parts about child labour and child protection, these are the relevant bits. I'm not going to go through them word for word. You can read them for yourselves afterwards. But suffice to say that fair trade just didn't kind of sit down and come up with these standards in a bubble. They're all based on the ILO authority as working conditions, and they're based on UN conventions for the rights of the child. So, these are not something that we've made up ourselves. We also have what we call a hired labour standard, which includes child labour requirements, and this is mainly aimed at fair trade producers which are have a lot of workers. So you might be thinking in terms of banana plantations, for example, here. And again, it's based on the ILO conventions. I'm sorry, the formatting is a bit strange here, but I hope you can read it. And that it says very clearly that if there is any risk of child labour in your company, you must implement relevant procedures, blah, blah, blah. So, and the third one is what we call our trader standard, and this requires compliance with applicable national labour laws and ILO conventions. Again, it encourages traders throughout the supply chain to adopt voluntary best practice, and it calls on businesses to source from producers with proven best practice as well. So we're covering the whole supply chain there. We're covering the small producers, we're covering the plantations and the hired labour, and we're covering the traders as well. So just briefly to talk about the action that we're taking on child labour, first of all, it's very important to stress that that fair trade adopts a rights-based approach to child labour. Elimination of child labour is informed by the guiding principles of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we aim to strengthen protection of girls and boys and vulnerable adults against harm. We aim to protect against the worst forms of child labour and related abuses, again, as defined by the ILO. And we encourage producer organisations at risk to build community-based self-governing systems. And this is really important. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second, because everything fair trade does puts the producers, the producer communities at the heart of their program. So it's not fair trade that comes along and wags a finger and says, you're doing this wrong, stop this, do that. What we do is we encourage the producers and the producer communities to sort their own problems out. On forced labour, elimination is formed by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we aim here to prevent forced or bonded labour, including trafficking and sexual exploitation based on ILO conventions, again. Forced labour and related abuses as defined by the ILO conventions. And we encourage producer organisations at risk to build community-based self-governing systems. So this is the important part. It's community-based self-governing systems. And so this is the project, if you like, the system that Fair Trade has come up with, that we successfully piloted and that we're rolling out. And it's one of those horrible NGO acronyms, I'm afraid, but it's called the Youth Inclusive Community-Based Monitoring and Remediation System, YICBMR, which is a real mouthful. But essentially, if a producer organization or a hired labor situation is found in breach of child and forced labor, this is what's known as a major non-compliance in fair trade parlance. So it's a big no-no. Producer organizations found in violation of these standards are suspended and they're provided with corrective action. So that's, again, it's important to know we don't just suspend them or decertify them, although that has happened, but we work with them to make sure it's right. So it's no good just kind of closing down a place or taking away their certification. What we want to do is to see them improve so they can continue to produce and trade as fair trade. This self-governing system is designed to detect and respond to child and forced labor. It's community-based and it enables continuous improvement. It puts producers in control of their own futures, and that's really important. For us, it encourages the active participation of children, young people, and adults, so it's not just about fair trade authority figures coming in and again, wagging the finger saying, you've got this wrong. It's about encouraging participation. It's a partnership between various organizations, including fair trade, but sometimes fair trade takes a back seat and lets others who are on the ground to take the lead. We have projects either underway or planned in a number of countries around the world. You can see them there. This is really important. The YICBMR system does not replace the audits that we carry out, or that rather our independent auditor FlowCert carries out, or government-based labour inspections. So this isn't a replacement for those very stringent audits, but it is a way of remediating if violations of the standards are found. Okay, I just want to finish by taking you through a very few examples of how we have been communicating about our work on child and forced labour in the last year or so. So this is an article from The Guardian from last year, written by our expert on child and forced labour, Anita Sheff. This is a piece that she also wrote for CNN last year. So you can see that we're getting some quite prominent exposure. This is from our own website. This is a story about Belize sugarcane farmers who actually were threatened with decertification because breaches had been found. This is a success story because instead of just kind of accepting that and doing the minimum, they really went to town and they devised their own system and they became kind of best in class. So this is a real role model for how you can turn those things around. Again, this is a blog from from The Guardian from just a few days ago, actually, June the 12th. This is from our Facebook page, talking about the work that we're doing in the textile standard. So the Fair Trade Textile Standard was launched just a couple of months ago. Excuse me. Just a couple of months ago, and it's designed to tackle these kind of problems throughout the supply chain. Excuse me. Here's a piece from All Africa. Here's a tweet. Beg your pardon. Here's an example of our Twitter feed. And I know I think I'm over time, so apologies for that. If you've got any questions, please do send them to me, and I'll hand you back to Faris. Just in time, it would seem.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you for sacrificing a little bit of your voice, and hopefully you have some time to recover before our Q&A. But I think that was a really, really interesting presentation that really showed, I think, a couple of very critical pieces of the consumer engagement side. I think one, we all know fair trade, and I think it's a really great and successful example of having a very kind of easy to recognize and ubiquitous, almost I guess, label that signals to consumers that there is in fact a robust and a rights-based management system in place, behind the scenes to help address human rights impacts and child labor, forced labor. So seeing that here and kind of looking behind the scenes is really helpful. And then also the importance of not letting that that simple label be the only kind of point of engagement with the audience and with consumers, I think is critical as well. And seeing that you have kind of a much broader approach of trying to reach consumers and the general public through very mainstream media, some of the more targeted media outlets, and social media as well. So I think a really good model, and I'm sure we'll have a great discussion later on. Next, then we'll go to Francesco Tramontin from Mobilise International, where he serves as Director of Public Affairs in Europe. And Francesco is responsible to coordinate Mobilese's external engagement strategy in Europe with a particular focus on sustainability, health and wellness. And Mobilise, of course, is one of the world's largest snacks companies, with now over 100,000 employees working truly globally in 165 countries around the world. Francesco has been in a number of different roles at the company, which I think really probably helps with develop a diverse perspective on some of these issues, including Director for Sustainability, working in both Europe and in the US, covering issues management and engagement with external stakeholders around sustainability and environmental issues. Prior to joining Kraft Foods and Mondelez, Francesco worked in government at the EU in Brussels, and working in the public sphere for Cargill, and then also Kraft Foods as well. Francesco, it'll be great to hear your perspective here from one of the largest companies in what I think is a sector where consumers are more likely to engage around these issues than they are in the example that I mentioned earlier around computers and electronics, right? So with that, I'll turn it over to you, and looking forward to hearing the presentation and encouraging, again, everyone on the line to think about questions for our Q&A session after the presentation. Francesco, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much, Faris, and I hope you can hear me well. Thank you for having me here. You already introduced the company I work for, so I won't go into details, but I just want to a little bit to understand. So let's try to put yourself in the shoes of someone working in a company like Mobilise with a truly global reach, with a big portfolio of products. As you said, Faris, maybe in food, maybe in some of our food categories, we are a bit far ahead in the journey, and actually fair trade has been one of the main drivers of progress with consumers in some of these parts of the supply chains, like chocolate. I'm thinking of business we had in the past, like coffee. But still, I think what you said before about are consumers consistently engaged on specific issues, and the answer is probably not, even in a sector where sustainability topics have actually been a bit more mainstream than other sectors, like food is. But I mean, as said before, you see, we are a global snack business. We are a global food business. We have a big exposure in emerging markets. And fundamentally, our categories are gum, candies, chocolate, and biscuits. So that's what we sell to consumers around the globe. So this is Mobilise, the corporation. And actually, I can appreciate Mobilise is a name you wouldn't know much. It actually, the snack business of the company that you know, it was Kraft Foods, and that's what you'll find it in my resume. Now, when it comes to talking to consumers, it's our brands that count. And again, I'm not showing you this to impress you, but just to kind of give you a sense of what's real to consumers. What's real to consumers is not Mobilise, but what's real to consumers are our brands. And as you can appreciate, our brands are very, very different, and they talk to different consumers. If you're buying Toblerone chocolate, is very different from buying a breakfast biscuit like Belvita, and it is very different from buying Oreo. So we speak to different consumers in very different markets across the globe. So why there is global trends, and fortunately mainstreaming sustainability topics like human rights is one of those trends. It's still difficult to kind of outline those trends across the globe for the reason, and so the same things that Faris was saying before, we see it every day. So again, so Mobilise talk to shareholders, Mobilise talk to stakeholders, and our brands talk to consumers. So how do we join the dots between some of our corporate programs and our consumers? It somehow needs to build into our brands as much as our corporate programs. So, as said before, and especially if I look at the products we sell, you would argue that still not all our consumers have human rights in mind when they buy our products, when they go in a supermarket and choose biscuits, whether it's ours or the competition, not necessarily human rights, not even sustainability as a broad trend or sustainably sourced program, very often are not one of their mainstream concerns. But what it is, increasingly, is this broad concept of well-being. And think of yourself as consumers. What you do when you want to make a purchasing choice is overall feel good. Feel good about yourself. And again, if you're looking at buying biscuits and chocolate, there's a clear feel good element in treat and indulgence, but also making sure that products are kind of good for you in a certain sense. Even if you buy a biscuit, even if you buy a chocolate, more and more consumers are conscious of the health concerns, for example, and that's a bigger part of the impact we have as a company by selling the product we sell. And increasingly, consumers are conscious about the way products are sourced. Now, maybe each one of those things are not mainstream in themselves, But if you bundle them together into this broad concept of well-being, it's actually a growing consumer trend that we say. So as a company that wants to do good for its shareholders, stakeholders, but also to be good to our consumers, we have this vision, and that's what we talk ourselves about, being a leading well-being snacking companies. To do that, we need to work on a number of issues and catalyze change. Obviously, the scope of what we do is very large, so we cannot do it across the board, and we need to be choiceful, and we need to focus where we can have an impact. Which makes me jump now, again, as a big snacking, chocolate, and biscuits business, on our agriculture supply chain. As you can appreciate, as I said before, one big area of impact is our consumers and what they do with our products. On the other side, one big area of impact, for things you surely understand, is our agriculture supply chain, being a large buyer of certain agricultural commodities. Given the categories where we operate and given our footprint, there's two commodities in particular where we can have an impact, just because, again, we are big and we can catalyze systemic change, as I tried to show you in the slide before. Those two parts of our supply chain, again, that's not all we do, but just want to give you a sense of focus and where we believe we can truly drive change. Is obviously cocoa, being the largest chocolate company in the world and a sizable larger buyer of the world cocoa. We can certainly have a responsibility to drive systemic change. On the other side, and with very different type of issues, we are a large buyer of wheat for our biscuits. That's not in developing countries like cocoa. That's mostly in the US and the EU. So less relevant from a purely human right impact, but big in environmental impact. That's wheat. So we call this our flagship program. That's where we think we can drive change, and that's where we engage. So what I'll do now to talk about specific issues of human rights, child labor, is obviously for us, it is cocoa. As you know, cocoa is grown into countries. Mostly, 70% of the cocoa comes from Ghana and Ivory Coast, and it's a place where there are concerns over human rights in our supply chain. As Mark has said before, it's very difficult, it's impossible to guarantee, but as responsible businesses, we need to find a way to kind of drive change and change it. And the reason we have to do it, as I said before, is because our chocolate brands need it. I mean, a vibrant cocoa supply chain is essential for the future of chocolate. And this is the main reason why we do it. And actually, some of the issues we've been discussing here is kind of the very negative side of the coin that we need to eliminate. So, continuing this is that cocoa farming, it is a challenging reality. It is not an easy situation. It's a situation that we know it's not sustainable. So if we want to continue to supply cocoa in the future, some of the issues I'm outlining here, they need to change. They need to change in the future. And I'm talking about low productivity, aging trees, very poor community development, and more, I would say probably more important than anything else, the next generation of cocoa farmers is not inspired, is not incentivized to stay in cocoa. So it's first and foremost a business challenge. So we decided to commit, and that's the part where I want to pay attention, is for us, connecting to our consumers and connecting to our supply chain is not just about outsourcing the work to someone else, putting a logo on our products and just making sure our consumers are happy and satisfied and feel comfortable things are being taken care of. For us, and that's what we decided a few years ago, our commitment is to engage more and more in our supply chain. We don't buy cocoa direct from the cooperatives. We don't contract farmers directly. So for us, it's a journey to engage our supply chain, and a journey that starts by investing and committing investment to cocoa community and in partnership with others. So that's where our journey starts. And our journey starts by trying to invest in the farmers that are in our supply chain. So this is our commitment to the issues in our cocoa supply chain. And it's based on 3 principles, and these principles are very important. So first of all, farming communities are the starting point. Not our brands, as I said, not a cool logo on our brands, not kind of a flashy marketing campaigns, although our business is marketing driven. What we do is basically invest in the communities. We do it in partnership because, again, we are not development experts, we are definitely not human rights experts, so we need to work with organizations such as Fair Trade. I mean, we are a large buyer of Fair Trade cocoa, for example, and to basically help drive this change. And more importantly, it's not just about having some cool programs on our supply chain. It is about making sure that we do source from those communities that we invest on. So this is a fairly new approach. I mean, if you think about sustainability and these issues a while ago, it would have been just about making sure your cocoa or your coffee or whatever commodity you were buying was meeting a standard. This basically reflects a shifting mentality, which is holistic in the sense that we invest in communities and in livelihoods, and basically we try to make the connection in our supply chains. We do it looking at specific impact measurements, and I'll just kind of try to go quickly, and we can always go back in some of the questions, but just to say there's a specific set of KPIs across all the cocoa we buy. One of these KPIs areas called youth, and actually reduction in instances of child labor and forced child labor is one of the KPIs that we are going to measure. And this is not about just checking a box, it is about measuring impact, as also Mark reflected in his presentation before. And it's done through verification, because we understand our consumers and stakeholders still need that third-party element to it. And we do verify our supply chain. As I said before, we want to buy cocoa from those communities, and actually we do partner with organization, in this case FlowCert, which is kind of part of the Fair Trade family, help us kind of follow our cocoa through our supply chain. Now, all this is meant to show impact, as I said before. It's not about checking the boxes, simply checking the boxes of a number of practices, saying we've done this, we've done that. It's about showing impact on the farming communities we show for. And what is more important, because this is all fairly new to us, so we started this in 2012, it does provide unique stories for our consumers. So all I've told now is very corporate, it speaks to our stakeholders. What I'm trying to say, without just showing what the marketing campaigns are, is that, and you can see on the right part of the slide now, all this is a very engaging and positive story for our consumers, because at the end of the day, our consumers are not engaged by the avoidance of the negatives. This is something they want us to take care of. They want to be more engaged into the story, stories which are behind cocoa, and actually our increased engagement in our supply chain provides for those hooks for our consumers. This all means also, if you look at the journey companies, and again, it's not only Mondelez, it's some of our peers as well, have been making in sustainability in the last 10 to 15 years, so it's a fairly recent journey. It's a quite radical shift in mentality. So we went to talking about standards and checking the boxes, about talking about the way to go about things and across the board benchmarks. We went from talking about premiums to actually, as I'm trying to say, so invest in origins. There's a concept of traceability, following the beans. At the end of the day, what is important is transparency. It's this idea of very corporate volume commitment, and now we are talking more and more about impact and measurable results for farmers. And I think what is really important when we talk about consumers, it's less about stakeholder acceptance, and I'm not discounting it, so it's less about avoiding campaigns and being targeted in child labor campaigns, for example, but actually it's really about engaging the communities we work on, which, coming back to the point I'm trying to make, is a more compelling story for our consumers, and a story that our brands will more and more use in consumer engagement. And again, I hope I also exceeded my time, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, and I'll get the opportunity to tell you a bit more there. Otherwise, you'll find all the story about our increased engagement in cocoa on our website, cocolife.org. Thank you very much, and speak to you later.
Thank you so much, Francesco. That was another excellent presentation, and thank you for giving us kind of a insight and a look into how Mondelez is addressing these issues. And again, I think similarly to the fair trade presentation, we see just the importance of having a robust management system in place. There's really nothing that can substitute for that, and then translating that into engagement with consumers and consumer understanding and awareness is the difficult challenge. I think one thing that stuck with me from your presentation, or two things really, Francesco. One is just this consumer expectation that what you buy and what you put in your body is good, is inherently good. There isn't kind of a question in the consumer's head of like, should I buy the good product or the bad product? There's simply kind of an expectation that everything that you find on the shelves is good for you and is made with good working conditions. And so meeting that expectation is really the critical challenge. And then second, of course, is you very effectively highlighted the limits of doing these presentations on a webinar, because I think all of us were wishing you were able to pass around some samples of chocolate to all of us to have while we're listening to your presentation. With that, though, and I see we already have questions coming in from our audience, so thank you for that. We'll get to those in our Q&A period, but I want to introduce our final speaker here today, Aisha Barenblatt, and I'm super excited to introduce you, Aisha. Aisha is a social entrepreneur with a passion for building sustainable supply chains that respect people and our planet. And Aisha founded Remake, which you can find at www.remake.world, to use the power of films and media and visual storytelling to create a conscious consumer movement and engaging consumers in these new innovative ways. And Remake stories appeal to the hearts and minds of millennial consumers to advocate for the women who make our clothes in factories around the world. So we're shifting a bit on the industry side and getting that new perspective. Aisha had been working at Better Work, which is a World Bank and United Nations partnership to ensure safe and decent working conditions around the world. But most importantly, Aisha was my cubicle mate when we both worked at BSR, Business for Social Responsibility, where Aisha was heading up the consumer products team, providing strategic advice to a number of the apparel companies, Levi Strauss, Marks & Spencer, Nike, and others. And Aisha is also an alum of UC Berkeley, so she must know what she's talking about. Aisha, I'll turn it over to you for your presentation, and then following that, we will bring it back to the whole panel for our Q&A discussion with all of you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Faris, for that really kind introduction. I am so thrilled to be here. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Given all the different countries on the line, it's clear we're truly having a global conversation. 1 second of background on me and why I left the stability of my UN job to do the crazy startup thing. Much like Faris and some of our colleagues that you've heard earlier, I have been working on the human rights of the people who make our clothes for over a decade, working across industry, local governments, unions, retailers, and brands to drive collaboration. And the one thing that was really missing in this work was an actual seat at the table for the consumer. And so Remake is very young, we're a year old, but fundamentally our focus is to build a conscious consumer movement. It's giving all of you as consumers in your everyday life actionable ways to make a difference. And so I think in order to do that, a little bit of context on why this is important and why the history of our clothes is tied so much to human rights abuses, to trafficking, to forced labor, to child labor, I think is helpful. One of the stats that always blows me away, and it's really something for us to think about our own culpability, is if we look at discounting for inflation 10 years later, we pay less for our clothes today than we did 10 years ago, and somehow we are buying 4 times more than we ever did before. And I think this phenomenon in particular is the phenomenon of fast fashion, which, much like fast food, what this means is that in order for retailers and brands to get us cheaper, faster goods, there's a price to pay. That price, obviously, in terms of cutting corners, takes a hit on our environment. You often think of oil as a very dirty industry, but fashion, in fact, is the second largest polluter after oil. Often when I tell people that, it's quite startling because fashion is sort of fun. When you think about the front-end marketing, it's very different from the mass environmental degradation and pollution that happens on the back end. Additionally, another issue that's quite troubling and I think really far removed from consumer consciousness is with the era of more mixed fibers, with more chemicals in our clothing, it's increasingly difficult for us to be able to break down our clothes. And so a lot of our clothes sit in landfills. One of the things that we do outside of online engagement is a lot of campus conversations. And right here in San Francisco, we've started to talk to the city of San Francisco on taking students to see where the clothes are sitting, just mounds and mounds of them, t-shirts, jeans. So you have a very visual understanding of this thirst for ever cheaper, sooner, faster, and what the environmental impact is. But turning to the topic of today, the story of our clothes has sadly been tied to human rights abuses for a very long time. This is just a snapshot, a 6-month snapshot ending year 2012, beginning 2013, when we had some of the biggest industrial disasters of our time, fires. I think about Rana Plaza, and at that time I was with the ILO. One of the things we know is that the human beings that were walking into that building that day, stitching for Joe Fresh and Children's Place and Walmart, they didn't want to go in because as they walked into that building, they started to see cracks on the ceiling, cracks on the floor, and there was a question of safety. But the vendors in the room were under a lot of pressure to get the products to us in time for deliveries, and so they were forced to go into a building that ultimately ended up collapsing and killing over 1,100 people. And so as I start to tell you this story, there's also, beyond the very human impact of the industrial disasters, we know from the history of the fast fashion industry and the way our clothes are made that we continue to see very troubling hotspots of children that show up, whether it's in Uzbekistan, where a lot of our cotton comes from. Human Rights Watch talks about 1.5 million to 2 million children who are pulled out of school during the summers to help with the harvest. It's partly because of the price points, but also because you talk about the agility of children's hands and the fact that they can get to the crop sooner, faster. It's not just restricted at the cotton end. You look at ginning, weaving, embroidery, leather, cut sew, where a lot of our clothes are made. In India, it's well documented. You start to see children moving from the south to north to help with factory production. We've increasingly started to see troubling reports within Turkish factories of Syrian refugees, particularly children, working in factories there as well. So the sort of global context of how our clothes are made is very much tied to this thirst that we all have of sooner, cheaper, faster. And the repercussions are there's only so many corners that we can cut. And unfortunately, one of the most variable costs in this equation become the human beings that make our clothes. And so as I start to tell you this story, and for many of you this is perhaps not a new story, I'd wonder, because we're talking about consumers here, how this makes you feel. I'd be curious in the Q&A as we started to talk about the horrible conditions and the images that were flashing on the screen, whether you started to disengage a little bit, started to check Facebook on your phone. And I think this is really important in the fundamental mission of how we are trying to tell the story differently, because for too long the only form of consumer engagement has been to call for boycotts. Faris and I both have deep roots at UC Berkeley. It was a really important time in the 1990s when more and more of our production was moving overseas, for us to call for action to boycott product and to really have a better understanding of how people were being treated that were making our clothes. But unfortunately, just the call for boycotts is simply not practical. I really enjoyed Faris's early example about laptops. Everything that we buy, it's impulse decisions. Fashion is a very joyful experience, and to simply expect people to just boycott all the time just only goes so far. The other problem with this is just becoming desensitized to the issues. This pain-centered narrative of constantly just seeing human beings far away that look different from you, that you see child labor, forced labor, fires, and at some point it feels so far removed from your reality that it's very hard to think about as a consumer how to take the human rights values that you have in your heart and to make a difference with your wallet. And so we are here to tell the story very differently. And so the second story I want to share with you is the story of the maker. We are very deliberate about moving away from the language of workers and working conditions and the way a lot of companies report them as numbers in their sustainability reports, because these are human beings who make and create value for us. And so when we are on campus and we are online, we start to tell the story very differently. And the story is this: there are 40 million people, at least legally, that are working in the fashion industry. It's a she. She happens to be a woman, and she is mostly 18 to 24 years old. And the difference today with how it's cheaper to use film, to use social media, we're able to understand her, meet her, come face to face with her in a way that was never possible before. When I used to sit with a lot of industry stakeholders and colleagues, it was often the industry talking amongst themselves to fix issues. But now what Twitter and Facebook and Periscope allows us is this democratization of information. And so what we've been doing in the first year of our life as a startup is to start to go to production hotspots and meet the human beings that make our clothes, sit down and have meals with them, follow them into their homes, and let her tell her story for herself. And the gamble that we're taking here is that if all of you as consumers met her, and we particularly target 18 to 24-year-olds because the idea is that it's before your shopping habits are set. This is why we're on campus a lot. And the through lines of her life and your life and the perils are actually quite striking. And it seems to have really hit a chord with the class lectures and such that we've done so far. You leave for university, she heads from her village into a factory. You are probably encumbered with college debt and hoping for a life of dignity afterwards. You're probably, as a woman, dealing with harassment on campus. Much like that, her life in the factory is a lot like your life on college. She's for the first time entering the big bad city life. She's often harassed because it happens to be that most people that make our clothes are women and the supervisors happen to be men. She's also increasingly digitally connected. I've been amazed by in how many communities we now have Facebook friends who happen to be people working directly on the line, who can text us on WhatsApp. And so one of our first ways to start to bring the human beings behind supply chains to the consciousness of consumers is to unmask her, the invisible woman who makes our clothes. And I think the hope is that if you continually come face to face with her in a very human way, so, Faris mentioned we do short stories, we run social media campaigns. Right here in San Francisco, we even did a bus ad, which is very successful. So it's, you're about to go to work, you look up, and there she is. And she says, I made your shirt, get to know me, change my life. And I think it's also moving away from this pain-centered narrative and feeling very overwhelmed about, is there something I can actually do, to giving you a sense that, first of all, as human beings, we're fundamentally connected, and that she has her say in her life. And now that you know her, here are some actionable ways to make a difference. So Faris posed a question to us around, who are the consumers that we should be engaging? And from the research that we've seen, the market studies, and our focus is fundamentally the millennial. Now, there's a lot of data out there, and I don't profess to say that, this is just one homogeneous generation that has exactly the same value system. But one thing is certainly clear, particularly here in the United States, but increasingly across Europe, and that is the next generation that's going to be thinking about their spending habits, coming into their purchasing power, is increasingly more racially diverse. This is an image from National Geographic that ran a story of the future face of America, and the story often talked about how it'll be very hard to tell your ethnicity just visually. We're increasingly going to be more people of color. And so we believe that these trends really work in terms of the human connection that we're building, because there's this less of an otherness and this recognition, particularly with this generation, as you look at some of the social justice issues of our time and how they've taken both the social media and the streets to talk about both issues right here at home and globally, that this is a very mission-minded, socially conscious generation. And so our hope is that by really targeting millennials, particularly because it's mostly millennials that make our clothes, that we can build more of this connection and empathy and start to create advocates for her well-being. So that's really the theory of change, but I promised that I would give you a few very practical pieces of advice as an everyday consumer on what you can do. I think Christina and Faris had mentioned perhaps some of your students are right here on the webinar as well. And, it often becomes very overwhelming to say, where do I even begin? Do I throw everything out? Do I ask a lot of questions? Why is the onus on me, the consumer? How do I even trust brands when they're marketing to me and greenwashing? And so the first thing that we often tell our students and our online community is to start to ask questions. One of the most powerful exercises, even for me personally, has been to just go inside your closet and just look at all the labels and where it was made. And as you start to see the different countries and understand what a global representation of human beings are in your closet, you start to fundamentally change your relationship with your clothes, and this understanding that the hopes and dreams of hundreds of people from around the world are right there. So I think the first is just that awareness that there's 100 hands that touched our clothes before you bought it, and to start to think about that. I think the second is starting to move away from the trends of fast fashion, because simply when something is priced at a price point and you can do the math, a $19 pair of jeans or a $10 t-shirt, then you know that the blood of somebody is on their hands. It's just that simple. So saying no to fast fashion and going back to fewer, better things. So durability. And one of the things that our community quickly said was there is no place for us to go and find ethical fashion that is affordable and stylish. And so we are slowly but surely starting to become that one-stop shop for you to do that. If you follow us on Instagram, our hashtag is #RemakeOurWorld. You'll start to see lots of different examples of ways to buy product that looks great, that you can still be on trend, but making a difference. So it's really about asking questions and being curious, choosing durable over disposable. And, the third and final bit of advice is whenever you buy something, you now have easier access to brands on Facebook, on Twitter, to simply ask the question, I bought this, I want to know more about her. who is she? Because as we increasingly start to increasingly start to set questions up the supply chain, then retailers are going to have to start to become more transparent. And so that's really a critical part of our conversation is we can have these conversations now with retailers, with brands, and frankly also with celebrities. I mentioned that you can find increasingly brands that are moving towards more of the slow fashion movement, much like you saw with food. This is one of our partners, Indigenous Brands. What you can do when you buy their clothes is by scanning the barcode, you can come face to face with the woman who made it. And so increasingly there is this movement of building deeper connections with suppliers in communities, whether right here at home or globally, and having an understanding of your working conditions. And so the final thing I will leave you with is an example of one of our campaigns that we just did. All of you know Beyonce. She is probably one of the most iconic stars of our time. She also was recently won the CFDA Fashion Icon Award of the Year. And what's interesting is that she's also recently started to dabble in design and has a line, Ivy Park. And if you've seen any of the advertising for Ivy Park, it talks a lot about women's empowerment and sharing in the determination of this hardworking star of our time by wearing these clothes. And the reason I pull on this is that, when we think about how we buy, a lot of it is sold to us through models and celebrities and designers and us really wanting to emulate how they look and what they say. And to me, what is fascinating about Ivy Park is, so the line is made in Sri Lanka. Today we know that these are not desirable jobs, that a woman in Sri Lanka is not making a living wage by sewing this product. So the dichotomy of here you are as a woman being asked to buy something and share in the empowerment of this celebrity, but on the back end, we have no understanding of whether the woman who made it is empowered in any way. So I'll stop here I have a short video to give you an example. It's just 30 seconds of how we engage our consumer community. If you are so inclined, reach for your phone and open Twitter because we want you to write to Beyonce directly and ask her a few questions. So if you could cue the video, and then I look forward to questions after. Thank you very much.
Excellent. This is Faris again, and thank you, Aisha, for a great presentation and for the quick video as well. I think it's a nice kind of summary of your remarks and the importance of consumers engaging directly with the brands on these questions and elevating the maker to the same level of all the other kind of leaders along the supply chain, right? And I think you've left us with a hopeful and optimistic message. I think that even though it is a very difficult challenge for all of us as consumers to even understand the complexity of the challenge, and then let alone do something about it, I think having some very clear guidance for all of us, I think, is really helpful. And one thing that really stuck with me is this idea of, to borrow your company's name, to really remake business models in the process, right? And shifting from fast fashion to durable and high quality and ethical fashion, and at the same time demonstrating that is actually possible today. Maybe not yet at scale, but I think it's a really optimistic and hopeful message to end our presentations on. And with that, we're going to go now to our Q&A panel. And again, we invite you to ask your questions. You can use the chat function, the Q&A panel on the WebEx interface. Some of you have already shared your questions with us, and I think we have quite a few already for all of our presenters. And the first one is for you, Martin, at Fair Trade, and it's a question about essentially the governance and relationship between Fair Trade International and then your local member organizations. And the question is whether Fair Trade member organizations in Europe undertake any of their own activities in the area of labor and human rights conditions in the supply chain. So do they work independently on their own initiatives in that area? I'll turn it over to you, Martin, maybe to provide a quick answer on that, and then we'll go to the next question.
Sure. Thanks. Actually, you can now see me in all my glory as well, and I have to say, ethical fashion or not, I'm probably not a very good advertisement for it. Well, very briefly, the way that Fair Trade works is that Fair Trade International is the coordinating and the sort of umbrella body for fair trade organizations around the world. But all the standards we have, which I refer to the three standards that are applicable to what we're talking about today, so the trade standard, the small producer organization standard, and the hired labor standard, those are common to all fair trade entities, if you like. So we have common standards that apply across the board. So, but clearly different organizations have different priorities. So we've been talking a lot about fashion today and textiles. So the textile standard, which was introduced earlier this year, was very much led by Fair Trade Germany, with obviously with support from other fair trade organizations. Other organizations have different priorities. So Francesco from Mondelez will know for sure that the UK is a huge fair trade chocolate market. So in that case, a lot of our work is done through the UK office. But it's a federation of organizations. We share common standards, we share common goals, we share common aims, and so these are kind of a globally applicable way of working, if you like. So whether it's the textile standard or whether it's the hard labor standard, the child protection, child labor and forced labor policies that we have apply right the way across the board. So all the fair trade organizations are signed up to those and are fully behind them. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Martin. And next question then is for Francesco. And it's a question about, really interesting, about competition for these types of programs to advance human rights in the supply chain. Are on-the-ground investments focusing on securing sustainable supply from smallholder farmers taking place in a crowded market? Are there competing efforts targeted at the same farmers. So, for example, a Mondelez program and a Nestle program targeting the same farmers. And can farmers make a choice between different efforts, or are supply chains and associated programs completely separate and non-overlapping? Francesco, do you want to take that one?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
And I try to get video as well. I hope you see me. You see me too. So, the answer is, in principle, investment programs do not compete. So farmers do sell to us, do sell to Nestle. But if you talk about investing in farming communities, there's no, a farmer can decide what type of external help they get, of course, but there's no clashing itself because it's just support to the farmers. Where traditionally there's been an overlap and sensitivities of the type that are raised in the question by David, is when it comes to particularly tight code of conduct or standards. There you tended to have overlaps. And that's why we, as I try to explain, we try to shift away from this idea of checking the boxes and telling the farmers what to do, to kind of investment. These farmers, they said both to Mondelez and Nestle, they can do what they want. Now, if you look at cocoa as well, again, there's so much need for investment that I wouldn't call about overcrowding. I think actually much more is needed. With competitors, what we are trying to do is that, because we realize we are engaging more, is that we've created, at least with the big companies and with the suppliers, a framework of action. It's called Cocoa Action, where we actually try to map out who does what and where, exactly to avoid to do things 2 or 3 times, or to kind of overcrowd, as you're suggesting, on kind of just, for example, few organized farmers. So this is the part where we should not compete. We obviously compete a lot when it comes to actually sourcing the cocoa and market our products, but that's a different story.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francesco, for that. We have a quick follow-up question for you, actually, and that is, what other plans does Mondelez have to further commit to human rights in the supply chain?
Yeah, I think we are far from having solved the issue, as I was saying before. I mean, this is a journey, not a destination. As Martin has said before, we are not in a place today where we can give absolute guarantees, but we can put in place our best efforts. So definitely, we kind of just started this journey of engaging more in our supply chain, including in addressing some of the issues as the one that I mentioned, as cocoa, which, as I said before, is the part where we believe we can really make a difference given the size of our company. Now, it's also a journey to try to kind of provide good guarantees across the board. So I'm sure there's other part and other commodities that we buy where we need to have a closer look, and we'll keep on doing that. So.
Yeah. Excellent, thank you. And then Aisha, a couple of questions for you, and I'll give them to you both, and then you can answer them in turn. The first one is kind of a quick follow-up question on your presentation, which is where are your statistics from? And I believe that refers to some of the stats around the challenges and disasters around Rana Plaza and others in Bangladesh, the number of child laborers, the number of women working. I think it would be helpful, probably also to a lot of the students for their research work, to know what sources you're using there. And the other one is around the Ivy Park line and getting your perspective on what Beyonce and her company should do in this case. Ivy Park has come under attack for producing garments in factories where workers aren't paid a lot. And wouldn't it be opportune for Beyonce to make a point by implementing a system that allows for living wage premiums being paid to workers? If others can do it, why not Ivy Park? Do you want to comment on that?
Absolutely. And Thank you for the excellent question. So in terms of a lot of the stats, they're from the ILO, from the International Labour Organization. Some of the forced and child labor stats are from Human Rights Watch. And what we can do is send on the slides with some of the direct sources. I think particularly when it comes to child and forced labor, because some of this is so shadowy, the numbers are all over the place, but I found Human Rights Watch, ILO, and then SOMO to be a pretty credible source of information. Also, the CNA Foundation has done some really good reports on, number of women that work in the garment sector and some of the different instances of hotspots of human rights abuses. So those are probably a few different sources. We usually triangulate, cutting across different sources to make sure that the numbers are in the right vicinity. But I think sort of 40 million women working in the garment sector is a pretty common stat that you'll see. And if there's students who are interested in both doing research with us, accessing any of our materials as a nonprofit, they're very open source, and so happy to do that. And in terms of the question of Ivy Park, I think it's an excellent question. And part of, I think, the reason that the dialogue around these issues has been broken down so much is because everyone always shouts from their own corners. And I think, Ivy Park is a classic example of when some of the questions of the wage not being a living wage in Sri Lanka, the conversation went something like this. It was, the local Sri Lankan government obviously sets the wage. We pay minimum wage. Mass Holding, which is the factory that makes the products, said we're very much in compliance with the local laws. Why would you hold me to a different standard? And I think this is where starting to engage more with the creative and the celebrities and the people that are marketing, especially, I think here it really would be a missed opportunity on the part of Beyonce, because she's selling a line based on women's empowerment. And so, where better to start to experiment on whether or not all the women that are connected to that product are empowered along the way. And so you'll start to see with our campaigns, there's a lot more of pulling on these influencers and celebrities where historically they set the message on marketing, but have zero understanding of how the product is made and whether or not it's fair to people on the hidden side of the supply chain. So there have been instances of certain product. There's a University Colgate company that has done set up a fair trade factory in the DR. So it's not that it's not in the realm of possible, but I think it's simply early days in terms of some of that experimentation. So I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aisha. We have about 5 minutes left for Q&A before we go to concluding remarks to all of our speakers. So if you have a question, now will be the time to share it with us on the chat box. Martin, I think you wanted to comment on the question to Mondelez, and I'm not sure if it's on the competitiveness issue or next steps for the company. Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, Mondelez is one of Fairtrade's sort of major business partners, and we know those guys well. I think it's interesting when we start to talk about competition because there's a lot of consumer confusion between the different ethical labels that you can find. So you can walk into virtually any supermarket in any kind of Northern European country and be confronted by 3-4 different kind of ethical labels on coffee, on cocoa products, chocolate, and so on. And so in a sense, it's not surprising that consumers are becoming confused about which labels they can trust, if you like, and which ones are really rigorous. And increasingly, we're starting to see brands themselves starting to introduce their own certification labels, their own labels of, ethical sourcing. And so, I mean, one of the things I would say, and of course, I'm currently working for Fairtrade, so I suppose you could say that, I would say this, but one of the things that it's, I think, incumbent on consumers to do is to do their research behind those labels. What is the story behind the label? What's the actual impact that certification or that ethical label is having on the lives of the farmers, the producers, the workers who are getting those foodstuffs to our supermarkets. And, you know, I don't like to think of other labels as competition in a sense, because we're all trying to work towards the same goal. We have different ways of doing it. But there are very major differences, especially when it comes to child labor, forced labor, human rights, workers' rights. There are major differences between the labels, and I do think it's incumbent upon consumers to do their research and to, you know, make a judgment for themselves about which ones are the most rigorous and which ones really stand up to scrutiny.
Great, thank you so much, Martin, for that. I think we have 2 minutes left, and one final question here, which is on, you know, whether you all, and this is really for all of you, whether you see kind of a concerted effort here to create a gold standard on, you know, products that are made without human trafficking. In particular, so something similar to, you know, the Energy Star label that we have in the U.S. that is really scalable, that all consumers kind of instantly understand. Do you see us going there? And if not, what do we have to do to get there? And Martin, maybe you have you know, an opinion about fair trade's role in that as well. Why don't we start with you and then go to Aisha and Francesco?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't see a time where we're going to have one single label anytime soon. And in fact, I'm not even sure that would be desirable. You know, because there different certification schemes, different labeling schemes have different strengths and weaknesses and so on. But I would say that when we get to talking about human rights, child labor issues, forced labor issues, human trafficking in the supply chain, fair trade, you know, fair trade is it works throughout the whole supply chain. So many labels work with producers. Some labels or some schemes work predominantly with the traders and the brands. Fair trade works along the entire supply chain, and I think you're starting to see with projects like the textile standard, which we introduced earlier this year, that it's no good just looking at one part of the supply chain. It's no good just working with producers, just working with farmers, just working with traders. You've got to look at the whole supply chain, because otherwise it starts to break down. And I think, you know, that's where the future, if you like, of ethical labeling has to be. So you can be confident that the entire supply chain is clean. We're a long way from that, for sure, but that's where we should be getting to.
Yeah. Thank you. Aisha, do you want to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of strong opinions about this. I think it's a wrong question, Faris, in terms of all of us aspiring to have a gold standard. I have a lot of empathy for consumers, because you do have a lot of different types of certifications, labeling, I think with fashion in particular, because it's really complicated in terms of the supply chain. It's hard to know what aspect of the supply chain you're really looking at. You know, Patagonia is a classic example of a company that really exudes the values of sustainability. When they started to look beyond cuts, so where the product is made further upstream, they started to find instances of human rights abuses. And so I think, one, to put the onus on the consumer around trying to cut through the different certifications and having an understanding of what's real, what's not real, what's more holistic in life when we are very busy, I'm not sure is a practical recommendation. And so I think where the industry needs to head, and the signal that the consumer can send, is more for brands that are increasingly more transparent and telling us more about what they're doing in their sustainability journey, recognizing that it's not a destination but a journey, are the ones that we reward more, because we increasingly start to send a signal around, we'll pay more if we know that part of this is going back to improve the well-being of the human beings that make our clothes. And I think it's going to be more of that, rather than us trying to get to some kind of purist standard, because the supply chains are too complex for us to be able to do that.
Yeah, no, thank you. Very interesting take on this. Francesco, you have the last word on this question.
Yeah, so actually it made me react. I mean, the idea that you could solve some of these systemic issues with a standard is just, I'm not bought into that. Again, I speak for cocoa. If I look at the challenges in the supply chain and the idea, I mean, we'll use standard as a tool to help check and do, but again, what is needed is investment, what is needed is more engagement. So just another standard, another logo, even if it's one, it's not going to work beyond kind of the fact that I think another strong belief is that as said before, as Aisha said, we need to engage consumers with positive story. We need to create a movement. I don't think it's ethically correct to engage consumers. So I don't think consumers should have a choice on sustainability negatives. I think about it as you finish this call. So I wouldn't base my marketing around slave-free chocolate because it would be ethically wrong.
Very interesting. No, I think that's that gives all of us a lot to think about, and I think highlights also just the difficulty of the challenge and the fact that there isn't kind of a simple solution to that. With that, I'll turn it over to all three of you for some very quick concluding remarks and maybe to kind of focus you a little bit with that. Wondering if you have one kind of final recommendation for all of us as consumers and thinking in particular about not just the consumers here in the US or in Western Europe, but consumers in China and India and other kind of very important and growing in importance markets around the world. Any final recommendations from you on how we can be more aware and more engaged consumers and play a role in addressing human trafficking and human rights abuses in global supply chains? Final word, let's start with you, Francesco.
Yeah, so as I said before, I want to leave you with this provoking thought of there shouldn't be consumer choice on sustainability negatives. On the other side, as Martin has said, I think consumers should deep dive into the products they are interested in to understand more, because there are compelling stories, both positive and negatives, and there are human stories, and that's the best way to kind of create a movement.
Excellent, thank you. Martin, let's go to you next.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, what I would say, and this is both to buyers of fashion in general and to Aisha in particular, is if you have any kind of leverage or any kind of in with Beyonce, then ask her to sign up to the Fair Trade Textile Standard, because in that way, if she does, then within 6 years, all the people who make her garments will be being paid a living wage. So that's one very simple thing I would say.
Excellent, thank you, Martin. Aisha, you have the last word for today.
Martin, I wish Beyonce was my best friend, but you also have the power to reach out to her and say, hey, maybe consider having the Ivy Park line Fair Trade certified. I think that sort of democratization of information is really powerful. And the one thing I would leave you all with is, it's so easy to be overwhelmed. So let's start small, but dream big. So the next time you have to buy something, buy a beautiful ethical experience, talk about it with your classmates, with your friends, with your colleagues, and really recognize that you can now look stylish and at the same time make a difference in someone's life. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much, Martin, Francesco, and Aisha, for great presentations, great thoughts, and great advice for all of us. And thank you again to Christina, to Livia for having us and for hosting a wonderful series of webinars. And with it, I'll turn it over to Christina to give some closing remarks and finish the webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Faris, and thank you to all of our speakers today for their amazing contributions to this. We're so thrilled with the conversation, and I think we all want to go out and create a social movement now after this. So thank you for your inspiring words today. And this does conclude our series for winter-spring on human trafficking, the private sector, labor standards, and supply chains. So thank you for sticking with us. Some of you have been with us for all 6 webinars, so we can't thank you enough for your support and listening and contributions. So now we also want to announce that we are going to be starting again another series this coming fall. Because you all have stuck with us and joined us, we want to continue this and continue these conversations because we feel that they're very critical to this movement and continuing this conversation, particularly about what the private sector can do to counter human trafficking. So our next theme is new technologies, innovation, and entrepreneurship in tackling human trafficking, and this is a topic I'm particularly excited about, coming from Babson College, where we're working on entrepreneurship every single day. So we hope you'll join us for our next series. We'll be announcing the dates very, very soon. So look for the dates in our emails and also on my website and the Global Initiatives website. And again, I want to thank you for sticking with us for the 2 hours and for your contributions for this discussion. Thank you so much and have a great day and afternoon and evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.